In 2009, Warner Bros. Started development on a new DC Comics project featuring the Suicide Squad, a group of villains that go on dangerous missions for the US government to shorten their sentences. Suicide Squad released in 2016 and was met with negative reviews. 5 years later, in 2021, The Suicide Squad, written and directed by James Gunn, was released. The sequel was received far better by the general public and critics alike, though in late Corona times, it wasn't a big box office hit. In this essay, I will be focusing on the characters, specifically characterization and character development of these films. This essay is divided into 4 chapters. In Chapter 1, I'll be going into the theory surrounding these concepts, defining the terms, understanding what makes them relevant, and what methods exist for implementing them. Chapter 2 will be a discussion about Suicide Squad in relation with these concepts. Chapter 3 has the same concept as Chapter 2, but applied to The Suicide Squad. Finally, Chapter 4 is a conclusion, the results of this essay. Aside from their naming, these films have a lot in common. The structure and characters serve similar purposes in both films. Why did I choose these aspects of film specifically? There are so many elements to making a good film, why not analyze the cinematography, sound design, VFX, editing, or mise-en-scène? The reason that I specifically chose characterization and character development stems from the idea that plot, character, and setting are the 3 most important elements to a story. I wanted to study the narrative elements of this film, and therefore chose one of these 3. In my opinion, character is the most important part of most stories. Without strong characters, the plot feels empty and the setting is useless, leaving the end product muddled at best. Furthermore, that element was one of the most often criticized when it came to Suicide Squad, and something I personally really enjoyed about The Suicide Squad. Before we get into the quality of characterization and character development in Suicide Squad and The Suicide Squad, we have to define them. However, finding concrete definitions for such broad terms is difficult. Since these are artistic terms, they are subjective. What are the core functions of characterization and character development then? Characterization is generally used to create a baseline of what a character is like, what their motivations are, and how they interact with the world around them, while character development is all about how a character changes throughout a story. Characterization is a more generic term than character development. Where characterization is simply a tool to make a character more relatable, likable, or interesting, character development is more of an inherent concept to storytelling. Characters are usually split up into 2 groups. There are flat characters and there are round characters. A flat character is relatively uncomplicated and has few distinct traits, while a round character is the opposite, complex with numerous subtle or contradictory traits, usually changing over the course of a story. Most stories will start off with a character that has a flaw or something that is clearly missing in their life, who embarks on a journey to find that missing thing or change that flaw. This is one of the first few steps that is commonly known as the hero's journey. Character development is present in round characters and flat characters. A character that doesn't meaningfully change over a story is called a static character, but that is disconnected from the whole flat-round thing. Brandon Sanderson's lectures on writing science fiction and fantasy served as a valuable source for this video essay. Brandon Sanderson is a well-known writer with the Mistborn series and the Stormlight series under his belt, as well as writing recent entries in the Wheel of Time series. Sanderson gives writing lectures at Brigham Young University in Utah, and in 2022 recorded these to post on his YouTube channel where they are publicly available. The theory posed by Brandon Sanderson concerns itself with making people care about characters. This has to do with both characterization and character development. Sanderson states that a writer must establish 3 things to write a compelling hero. They must establish empathy, rooting interest, and progress. How does a writer establish empathy? According to Sanderson, there are 3 ways of doing so. Firstly, the writer can show a character doing something recognizable. The audience often appreciates being able to relate to a character on a personal level, so showing a character doing something that many members of the audience might have found themselves doing, spending time with children, reading a book, or killing an alien starfish, for example, is very effective for creating a link between the audience and the character. Secondly, showing someone being nice to others tells the audience that they are a good person. The audience trusts the nice person to be a good person. Thirdly, showing other people liking someone is a good way of establishing empathy. The audience trusts the judgment of other characters to tell them if someone is good. Even an evil character liking someone can be used to create empathy. It might simultaneously create distrust for the character, but this doesn't cancel out the empathy. Rooting interest is the reason that the audience might be interested in rooting for a character. How does a writer establish rooting interest? According to Sanderson, rooting interest is primarily rooted in motivation. Giving the character a reason to do what they do, whether that be good or bad, makes the audience much more interested in the character's story. For the motivation to be interesting, the character has to want something. Revenge, freedom, and justice are frequently used examples of this. What the character wants is out of reach for some reason. If they could get what they wanted without any issues, the story wouldn't be very compelling. Therefore, There has to be some reason that they cannot achieve or receive their wants. Finally, a character's motivation can be rock solid, but if it's not relevant to the plot of the movie, it's more or less useless. Finally, there are 3 ways of establishing a sense of progress. The writer can show a flaw that the character has to overcome. By showing the audience that something is wrong with the character, we immediately know that something has to change. That flaw changing throughout the story, even if it is just slightly, gives the character that progress. Another way of bringing that sense of progress into a character is to show them going on a journey. This can be physical, with them making their way across an island or city, as this does give the audience a sense of progress, with changes in set pieces being indicators for physical progress. But it can also be a mental journey, with the character's worldview changing throughout a film. The final way of introducing that sense of change is to create a mystery or a question surrounding a character's arc. This can be very specific to the story and the character, but it can also be more general, like what is going to change. According to Sanderson, these 3 factors don't all have to be present for every character in a story. Sometimes it's better to have a character for which we have very little empathy, especially in the context of a Suicide Squad. This is true, since the team is made up of villains. This theory is consistently accurate when it comes to pop culture. Some of the classic films in the sci-fi fantasy genres of the last 50 years tend to stick to this pattern. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, the MCU, and Harry Potter are all excellent examples of this. However, this theory doesn't outright mention the terms characterization or character development. The question is, can this theory be used when talking about the quality of these terms? The simple answer is yes. The core function of characterization within the story is to establish what a character is like and what their motivations are. But from a writing perspective, it is used to make people understand and care about your characters. In Sanderson's first lecture about characters, he directly mentioned that this structure is highly applicable to characterization. Another theory is Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, which was published in a book of the same name in 2005. The theory states that any protagonist requires 3 things: a problem or flaw that needs to be fixed, a want, something the character thinks they need, and a need, something the character actually needs. The character learns that they need it throughout the story. Save the Cat got its name from a simple idea. If you want a hero to be seen as good, you have them save a cat. And if you want a villain to be seen as evil, you can have them kick a dog. Now we can assume that Snyder chose the title Save the Cat because kick the dog doesn't have the same ring to it. This idea exists outside of cats and dogs as well. Often heroes will save a child instead, or just a person in general. On the other side of the spectrum, kicking the dog is often interchanged with killing or maiming someone. This only works if it is presented correctly though. A great example of this is found in the first season of Daredevil. The second episode is presented as a quest to save people, more specifically, one child. However, he also hurts people in pursuit of the kid. The next episode, he outright murders someone by dropping a fire extinguisher on their head from a number of stories high. So why is he a likable character? This season is presented as him doing these things to save people. The goal, the want, is good, and therefore the actions are relatively more justified in the audience's eyes, even if it is still portrayed as questionable. Now, let's look at the opposite. The DCEU's version of Batman. This version of Batman brands, maims, and kills criminals, but he does it for justice, and to make sure that no one else suffers the fate that he did when he watched his parents and eventually son die. The key difference between this and Daredevil is that Daredevil's goal is shown continually throughout the show as a tangible thing, while Batman's goal is mostly told to the audience. Where Daredevil goes out of his way to save people, Batman goes out of his way to punish criminals. Being too rough around the edges can cause the optics surrounding a character to change completely. Even if excessive violence is the character's flaw, the goal still needs to be present. The audience needs to recognize that the character is doing and why. Clarity and relatability are key. The final idea I will introduce in this segment is fairly simple, but extremely important. Show, don't tell. This is one of the most important and well-known rules of writing. The rule is exactly what it claims to be. To connect with an audience, the writer should show a character doing something instead of just saying they did it. The audience is completely uninvolved when a character just says that things happened. By showing them, the audience is more invested in what's happening because they're present for it. Are there specific rules that a writer adheres to when implementing characterization and character development? Yes and no. When it comes to film, there are no hard rules that you have to abide by. They're more like guidelines. Many filmmakers have a set of choices they systematically make, which have proven to be effective. But that doesn't mean everyone should always use them. If that were the case, film loses all of its artistic value and individualism. However, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't learn about them. It's important to understand the customs of filmmaking and why they are customary in order to develop our own set of customs. Are rules such as show don't tell objective rules? No, they're not always applicable. People often say that showing is better than telling, but that's not always true. There are some genres where showing is incredibly important. Body genres, where the physical acts are more important than the words spoken by characters, such as gore-based horror, commedia dell'arte, and pornography, will almost always choose to show something rather than saying that it happens, because that is, more or less, the point of those genres.
On the other hand, having a character confess to having done something,
or opening up about something that happened to them, can be incredibly impactful. When it comes to characterization and character development, what are the most important themes? There are 4 things that I think are worth mentioning here. Firstly, a character's introduction should be relevant to the plot in some way. If someone shows up out of nowhere, for no apparent reason, the audience usually doesn't care about them. Secondly, recognizing something a character does helps the audience to connect with them greatly. Thirdly, interaction between characters is very important. We need to see the relationships as much as possible. Lastly, character development isn't convincing without a journey. Characters need to develop in steps. Having a character start out one way and end the movie in a completely different way without sufficient steps makes the change wholly unbelievable and uninteresting. It's a character arc, not a character triangle. It is almost impossible to talk about this film and its reception without going into the rocky road it took to get to the theaters. Originally, David Ayer's Suicide Squad was supposed to be a darker story, with more serious characters and far fewer wacky moments.
We're bad guys. It's what we do.
However, WB caught wind of this, and after BVS tanked, WB thought the serious tone wouldn't work, instead opting for a lighter tone following the incredible success of Deadpool. In David Ayer's original version, Killer Croc was supposed to be King Shark. It was supposed to tie into the larger plot surrounding Justice League, and there were supposed to be character arcs. According to Jared Leto, the actor that portrayed the Joker, there was enough footage of his character to create a feature-length film starring the Joker. This isn't the only time that something like this has happened. In 2017, the very next year, Justice League came out to incredibly negative reviews. This film was originally Zack Snyder's project. Sadly, Snyder lost his daughter during the production of the film. This resulted in him quitting Justice League, which was continued by Joss Whedon, who had directed Marvel's highly successful counterpart to Justice League, The Avengers. This, again, to get to a more lighthearted version of the story. The backlash was very strong. Alongside the criticism, a new hashtag came into existence. #release the Snyder Cut. It was everywhere. On Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, people even made Tinder accounts to spread the message. Eventually, WB caved and confirmed Zack Snyder's Justice League, which was released in early 2021 on HBO Max. Alongside Release the Snyder Cut, similar movements started up. #restore the Snyderverse. #make the Batfleck movie, #Deathstroke HBO Max, and #release the Ayer cut, referring to David Ayer's original version of the film. It should be mentioned that cancelling projects, or indefinitely postponing them, is a consistent pattern for DC. Examples of projects that have fallen victim to this behavior are Chris McKay's Nightwing film, a Green Lantern show for HBO Max, a Harley Quinn Joker film set in the DCEU starring Margot Robbie and Jared Leto, Green Arrow Escape from Supermax, and Zack Snyder's further DC film universe, which would feature a Batman film directed by and starring Ben Affleck, a Deathstroke show for HBO Max, a potential sequel to Man of Steel, and at least 2 sequels to Zack Snyder's Justice League. The biggest difference between the movement surrounding the Snyder Cut and the movement surrounding the Ayer Cut is that Ayer's film has actually been finished already, while Snyder, his cast, and his crew had to return to film most of the eventual end product. WB can just throw the Ayer Cut on Max and be done with it. There's a better version of this generally disliked film around somewhere. Why not just release it? In October of 2022, a Twitter account that had been vocally supporting the movement to release Ayer's film posted a string of tweets claiming to have seen the Ayer cut, and announcing some ways in which it varied from the product that was released in 2016. David Ayer confirmed these claims, proving that this cut of the movie already exists. Following a merger with Discovery in the summer of 2022, WB cancelled Batgirl, a movie that was headed into post-production. This is not dissimilar from what happened with the Ayer cut, but there is a key difference between the two. Suicide Squad still got released. It wasn't at all what the director intended it to be, but a version of that film did end up being released. Batgirl didn't get released at all. The footage was allegedly already deleted a few months later. Reactions were varied, but it's safe to say that this was some fucking bullshit. You can't just go and delete hundreds of people's hard work, their art, for something as pathetic as a tax break. The cancellation of Batgirl sends a crystal clear message. WB don't care what they have to do as long as they get money. There are a fair amount of general issues with the character work in this film. The character's motivation is often completely absent on a larger scale for the entire story, but also for singular actions. They frequently act out of character in a substantial way, and the characterization can feel like a grocery list of traits rather than a cohesive person. This is, in part, to do with the first act, which tries to do too many things. It introduces the concept of Task Force X, explains why it was implemented in this universe, and establishes the most important members of the squad. It further seeks to introduce the Joker alongside his involvement in the plot, as well as the villains of the story. This extremely high amount of content for the first act of a 2-hour film makes it feel very busy, without taking the time to establish a connection to the members of the Suicide Squad, let alone the stakes of the film. A symptom of this is that Deadshot doesn't feel like a nuanced person, but is instead nothing more than an expert marksman with a daughter. The same goes for by far most of the other characters. That being said, Deadshot is one of the most fleshed out characters. Other characters tend to come off as caricatural. Harley Quinn is the Joker's crazy girlfriend. Captain Boomerang is a self-centered Australian with a unicorn fetish. Katana is a widow with a sword, and Slipknot is a man who climbs things.
The overstuffed first act further suffers from repetition.
We're introduced to Deadshot 4 times. It doesn't build on his character in a substantial way, it's just setting up his same motivation and character 4 times. First in prison, then during Amanda Waller's dinner, then in prison again with Waller and Flag there, and finally when they're gearing up to enter the city. This happens for a few characters. Harley Quinn, El Diablo, Captain Boomerang, Killer Croc, Enchantress, and Rick Flag are introduced multiple times. Furthermore, Katana, who is only introduced halfway through the movie and doesn't have multiple introductions, does suffer from the issue of her deal, i.e. her motivation and characterization, being both shown and told to the audience, not simultaneously through narration over a flashback, for example, which is what we get for a lot of other characters, but separately, right after one another. This issue persists with a few other characters.
Amanda Waller's dinner scene is the biggest offender here.
Another issue with the way that this film handles both the characterization and the character development is inconsistency. Characters don't always act in ways that serve their interest. This is especially problematic since these characters have all been shown to be, at least to some degree, selfish. A great example of this is Captain Boomerang's return right before the climax. There was no established reason for him to join the rest of the squad at this point. The best explanation I can come up with is that Boomerang's always come back, but that's flimsier than Enchantress as a villain. Another example is the way that Deadshot acts in accordance with his established motivation. He wants 2 things: freedom and his daughter. However, he acts against those interests throughout the movie. During the first altercation with the EAs, he takes center stage, drawing all the attention to himself. Surely, if he only wanted to see his daughter again, he wouldn't risk death so blatantly at the beginning of his character arc. There is an argument against this, though. His pride is also a motivating factor throughout the movie. However, his daughter and his freedom have consistently been shown to be more important than his pride. He also gets a chance to directly get his freedom and his daughter in exchange for killing Harley Quinn, but chooses not to. Finally, his daughter tells him that she loves him regardless of the fact that he kills people, but his character arc seemingly revolves around not killing. The only person telling him to stop killing, then, is Rick Flag, someone who he outright hates from the very beginning.
It seems counterintuitive for a character to change for someone they dislike.
In this movie, there is a clear attempt at giving the audience the feeling that members of the squad can die. There are a lot of casualties in the movie, but you don't really notice it. Out of all the people that die throughout, 5 are named characters: Slipknot, GQ, El Diablo, Incubus, and Enchantress. The other people who die are nameless SEALs or civilians. We see a group of them get turned into EAs, and others die throughout the mission, in ambushes from the EAs. Because of the lack of visual and narrative distinctness of the SEALs, the sense of danger that is supposedly added by them dying is lost. The death of Slipknot is also an interesting example. The character's in, 4 scenes before he dies? He was hurriedly introduced right before the squad headed into
Midway City.
He was the only squad member not to get an extensive introduction. Are we supposed to feel a sense of danger from this? There's this kind of weird tendency to sexualize female characters. Now, this isn't necessarily uncommon for comics or movies, and that's a whole issue of its own, but it really pops out at you in this film.
Take, for example, Enchantress, the main villain.
Her costume is halfway to non-existent. On the right, Enchantress from the movie. On the left, Enchantress from the comics around the same time. The differences are, to say the least, apparent. This design, paired with the character's function in the story, is just a bit odd. Enchantress's core function seems to be awakening her much taller and physically dangerous brother, and then letting him do all the big action while she stays in the background with her machine. Her abilities were simplified, not only making her far weaker than her comic counterpart,
but having her only notable abilities consist of teleportation,
casting a feeble illusion, and turning people into slave-like creatures by kissing them. Because of course it's by kissing them. That being said, Enchantress isn't the only character of such a nature. In Harley Quinn's case, this issue is slightly different because she's also sexualized on the source material, but even then, people tend to agree this is an especially egregious example of this. She's always a victim of someone else in this film. In every scene we see her in, she's either being manipulated by someone or she's acting in the interest of others. Officer Griggs, Amanda Waller, and the Joker are the primary perpetrators in this situation. But there is a case to be made for other characters doing the same.
This leaves a bad impression, as she is simultaneously sexualized, victimized, and infantilized.
After James Gunn was fired from Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, he jumped ship to DC, writing and directing a standalone sequel to Suicide Squad, aptly named The Suicide Squad. He then continued to write the entirety of and direct 6 out of 8 episodes of Peacemaker, a spin-off of The Suicide Squad. Gunn has since taken over as one of the heads of DC Studios. The Suicide Squad sees a large cast of villains take to working for the government in order to get a shortened prison sentence. The criminals are sent to Corto Maltese, an island off the coast of Central America. Generally speaking, the film was received far better than its 2016 counterpart. For example, The Suicide Squad received a score of 90% and 82% by the critics and audience respectively on Rotten Tomatoes. The earlier Suicide Squad didn't do so well, with a mere 27 critic score and 58 from the audience. Even on IMDb, the sequel has a rating of 7.2, with a lackluster 5.9 on the 2016 film's page. Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb aren't the most credible of sources. The overall ratings can and have been impacted by review bombing, and therefore shouldn't be taken as reliable data. But this does tell us something about the reception of both films. Applying the methods detailed in the first chapter might allow for a more reliable perspective. The nanite explosives seem to have more impact, as there's more emphasis put on the reduced sentences, especially from the perspective of Savant. Team 1 doesn't have much further motivation aside from the bomb, but Savant being convinced through the reduced sentence reflects on other characters. In the first film, there was far less emphasis on the reduced sentence aside from being mentioned at the start and finish once or twice. Perhaps the most noteworthy difference between the two films is the careful balance between positioning and furthering the character development with the progression of the story. At no point does it feel like these two are separate considerations. Even in the cases where flashbacks are used to give more background to one specific character, this feels natural, as the flashbacks shown to the viewer is the story that the character is telling their companions. That brings us to the way the characters interact. Use of many small moments of interaction continuously further the relationship between all the characters, giving a natural feel to their progressing relationships. Because those small moments happen frequently and between many different characters, the film feels much more cohesive. Another aspect that is more individual for the characters is that effort has been applied to ensure that the viewer can feel sympathy for all characters. Even a character portrayed as obnoxious, as Peacemaker was, is given a fragility of ego that makes it possible to have empathy for him. Even a character as callous as Savant, seen literally killing the cat, or bird in this case, in his very first scene, gets a human side that is quickly used to show us Amanda Waller's personality as she activates his nanite explosive. One of the biggest pieces of criticism that this film has received is its brand of comedy. Some people aren't necessarily the biggest fan of the dick jokes. That being said, this film does a lot of things that ground the tone in a darker foundation. The hard R rating allows for the bloody murder that sets the tone at the start of the film. However, the disposition relative to this setup, which is formed with the somewhat immature and light comedy, is a bit jarring. According to Gunn, this film is a war movie. This is seen not only in the death count, but also in the context of the film. Task Force X is essentially a Black Ops team. The US government sending a Black Ops team to a foreign nation to avoid bad optics is fundamentally an act of war. The genre of war film ties into the social criticism as well. Again, this genre choice doesn't necessarily match the tone. Another criticism is the way that character deaths are used here. The vast majority of Team 1 dies in the first 15 minutes of the film, and then no one dies until the final act of the movie, where Rick Flag, Milton the Thinker, and Peacemaker, sort of, as well as Polka Dot Man, all die. This gives the audience a lot of time in between where no one dies. This can take away from the unpredictability and danger. Speaking of characters dying, there are many characters from throughout the DC universe that show up in this movie. Never would I have personally expected that Mongal and Javelin share the screen, or be on screen at all. By far the most prolific character in the cast is Harley Quinn. Sure, Captain Boomerang and King Shark have appearances in other media and are fairly well-known characters, but they don't come anywhere near Harley Quinn. Harley is one of the most popular characters in the DC universe at the moment. She's had solo runs, live-action appearances, and even her own show. Going into this movie, people already kind of knew that she wasn't going to die. That lowers the stakes in certain contexts.
For the final chapter, I will compare the two films and the characterization and character development within them.
Firstly, I will focus on characters that have the same role in both films and characters that appear in both films. I will compare the characters based on the theory from Chapter 1 and the context of the films themselves. Then I'll take a look at the overarching strengths and weaknesses of each film. A crucial element to keep in mind is the fact that the rules from the first chapter aren't always applicable and are subject to change based on the story being told, as discussed previously. Harley Quinn is a central character in both films, and to the general public, probably the most well-known DC character in these films. Her life outside of these movies is quite relevant to the way she is portrayed. In terms of character development, this connecting tissue is actually where a good part of the development takes place. At the time of the development of the first film, there were concrete plans to produce a film about Harley and the Joker. The links to such a film are noticeable in Suicide Squad, in the interactions with the Joker during the film and with the escape at the end, where Harley is freed from prison, a direct tie-in for the planned movie. The planning for the relationship between Joker and Harley Quinn was so important to WB, in part because they were trying to establish the characters and their relationship as a marketable IP. The release date for Suicide Squad was set far in advance to cash in on lucrative deals around Halloween. The plans for that Joker and Harley film had a lot of impact on the shape of their relationship. The Ayer cut was supposed to have far more Joker in it. That's further proof of the impact of their relationship on the film. Even after all that, the Harley and Joker film never materialized. Instead, between the releases of Suicide Squad and The Suicide Squad, a Harley Quinn-focused film was made without the presence of the Joker. It is perhaps telling that the film was known as the Harley Quinn film during production, but was named Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn at release, and then was renamed to Harley Quinn Birds of Prey to attract more moviegoers. The core of that solo movie was how Harley deals with the breakup between her and the Joker. Becoming a more independent person, she also starts paying more attention to her environment and starts to care for more than just her own self-interest. Birds of Prey is a part of the same universe as both Suicide Squad films. Harley's development from her solo film is kept and applied consistently in the later movie. When we look at Suicide Squad, we see Harley characterized in a very codependent and immature way. All her actions in the movie seem rooted in acting as an extension of other people around her, in particular the Joker, Amanda Waller, and Officer Griggs. The flashbacks to her origin story give her almost no agency in the process, presenting her as a manipulated, naive victim. She's portrayed as very childlike, capricious, and out for instant gratification. This is consistent with how she is sometimes portrayed in the comics, but there her agency is much more defined, as she makes most of her choices by herself for herself. Combined with that almost childlike behavior, the way she is sexualized throughout the film, both through her costume and interactions with others, is pretty disturbing. When we look for her character development in the first film, it's hard to find signs of it. Her goals change in the third act, and she decides to go and join the squad after being separated from them. Up to that point, the goal had been get rescued by Joker. Unfortunately, the only clear reason she changes direction is because by then, the Joker has seemingly died. Now, call me crazy, but that doesn't sound like great character development, especially taking into account the later scene in which her ideal fantasy is a mundane life with the Joker as her husband. Even the artificially constructed team bonding moment in the bar is just her tagging along with the gang. In the later movie, we see a Harley that has evolved from her previous appearances. She is no longer pining for a husband, but fiercely independent and much more self-assured. The crazy part of her personality is still there, of course, as it should be. The childlike behavior is also there, though it is one of constant wonderment rather than pure naivete. Her clothing and behavior is much less sexualized.
She is still sexualized by her environment.
But aside from the fact that it happens far less frequently, she is in control of that situation and decisively ends it, and him, when she finds it necessary. Within the second movie, Harley again does not have much in the way of character development, just like the 2016 film. The characterization has evolved from the first movie, but doesn't change considerably from what is present at the end of Birds of Prey. Deadshot and Bloodsport may not be the same character in name, but they most certainly have a lot in common. Not only are they both sharpshooters motivated by their daughters acting as the leader of the squad, but they're also both the main characters of their respective films. Furthermore, concept art shows that Bloodsport was originally supposed to be Deadshot. This was changed due to Will Smith not returning as his character from the previous installment. After Idris Elba took the role, the choice was made to use a different character. To explore the similarities and the differences between these characters, we'll analyze some of the most important elements of both characters. We'll look at their respective relationships with their daughters and how their profession and lack of principles impacts their relationship with the other squad members. Both Deadshot and Bloodsport are assassins. Both have a high level of pride in their craft. Deadshot is introduced as arrogant, pressuring a client to pay him up front moments before performing a kill, and doubling the price because the client tries to renegotiate. Bloodsport is shown in a game of one-upmanship with Peacemaker. Both good scenes. While both cases use show don't tell, one is shown quite separate from the main story in a flashback, while the other is built up in different moments during the mission. Something similar can be said about the characters' relationships with their daughters. Deadshot gets a flashback where we're told directly that the only thing he cares about is his daughter. The moment where he decides to not shoot Batman in front of his daughter is just there to underline what we've already been explicitly told, and is in no way part of the main story. It's very clear that his interest in his daughter is self-service. He needs that relationship, and he needs her to see him him in a positive light. For Bloodsport, there's no flashbacks or spelled out motivation, but we do see how Waller coerces him into joining the Suicide Squad by threatening his daughter's life. He keeps his daughter at arm's length, realizing he's not a good influence on her, and ultimately joins the squad when her life is actually on the line. Deadshot's daughter is repeatedly brought up in Suicide Squad. We get multiple flashbacks, a gratuitous hallucination during the climax, as well as the handing over of letters she wrote him while he was in prison. Bloodsport's relationship with his daughter, on the other hand, is much more subtle. Bloodsport does mention his daughter a couple times, and the implication that Ratcatcher reminds him of her is very clear, even becoming explicit at some point. At the very end, we also see the daughter's pride in her father when the events of Corto Maltese are shown on TV, but it is not something he is aware of, or that could impact his character development in the scope of the film. The importance of this relationship is different in either film. In this case, there's many more moments during the first film that are meant to reinforce the motivation of the character, while there's only one or two in the second film. Those moments in the 2016 film are not very well integrated into the story, but there is something to be said about the persistence to remind us of Deadshot's motivation. That being said, the more understated show-don't-tell approach in the second film feels much more effective. In both films, the characters are confronted with how they kill for money. Not about the killing part of that, but about the money part. Deadshot is treated with scorn by Rick Flag, who makes it clear that he has nothing but disdain for someone who kills for money. Deadshot shoots back with the observation that Flag gets a salary from the US government to kill, so, what's really the difference? These interactions, together with the need to look good for the daughter, sets the character up to move from a reluctant participant to proactive leader. Bloodsport has a completely different relationship with Flag, with clear mutual respect, a common army background, and even a recommendation by Flag to have Bloodsport as the leader of the squad's main team for this mission. A very similar discussion about killing for money, or principles, does happen, however, between Bloodsport and Peacemaker. Those contribute to Bloodsport's need to be seen as better than Peacemaker. Additionally, the protective relationship with Ratcatcher 2 stands in for the more distant relationship between Bloodsport and his daughter. Again, we see similar mechanisms in use, where the tighter integration with the main story and characters gives us a much stronger effect. Both characters step up into a leadership role, both with similar forces working on them. Both start out prioritizing themselves, but end up protecting those around them. Both show character development. The main difference is that audiences tend to react much better to the version of the process that is more integral to the story and connected to its main cast of characters. Rick Flag seems to be fundamentally different in both films. In Suicide Squad, he refuses to be friendly to the criminals from the very beginning. This changes over the course of the film. In the Suicide Squad, with that character development already behind him, he doesn't seem to have any problem being friendly with the squad. There, his development is more centered around himself as opposed to being centered around other characters. Firstly, let's talk about his characterization. In Suicide Squad, we're told that he is the best soldier in the US Armed Forces. For that reason, he's the leader of the squad and the SEALs. He is portrayed as stoic and dominant, putting the mission ahead of his personal connection to the situation and keeping everyone in check. At the start of the mission, he is seemingly self-righteous and critical of others who he finds immoral. This changes to some degree at the bar scene. Here, Flag confesses that he has personal stakes in the mission and opens up to the squad. Although he's still the leader of the group for the rest of the film, his stoicism is dialed back and he is far less judgmental. In the Suicide Squad, Flag starts off more or less the same way he ended the last film. He is still the military liaison of the Suicide Squad and keeps the villains in line. He is characterized as empathetic, at least relative to the squad, assisting the freedom fighters and attempting to rescue Harley Quinn. His dominance and military expertise are still present. His military background is even referred to directly by Waller in Bloodsport, as Flag has served in the military alongside Bloodsport. This is another way that his empathy is reinforced through the film. Flag makes a conscious effort to connect with the members of the squad personally, especially with Harley and Bloodsport. In the opening scene, Flag even shows kindness to Savant, even though he doesn't know anything about him beyond his criminal record. Now, let's take a look at the character development. In Suicide Squad, Flag spends the first 2 acts of the film shit-talking the villains, constantly criticizing them on their morals, as well as their professions. A significant example of this is what we saw in the previous segment. He attacked Bloodsport's integrity based on his status as a hitman. This played into not only Deadshot's character development, but also his own character development, as it showed a status quo to be broken. Lawton repeatedly proves Flag wrong when it comes to his criticisms of the villains. Flag makes it clear that he doesn't believe that Deadshot will put himself in harm's way. In their first encounter with the EAs, Deadshot takes center stage. He proves that Flag was wrong. Flag's notions are disproved multiple times throughout the film. Seeing that he is wrong, Flag changes his approach and ends up respecting the squad when he understands their perspectives. In the Suicide Squad, Flag faces further inaccuracies in his worldview. Throughout both films, his position as a soldier is essential to the character, but in the sequel, he starts to question his commitment to his country when it goes against his morals. In the first film, Flag doesn't bat an eye when Waller kills an innocent crew of tech workers. He even says that he had been in similar positions and had made similar decisions. In the Suicide Squad, however, this mindset starts to change. Even though he still doesn't seem too bothered about sending criminals to their deaths to get the job done, he does start to make choices that go against the American government in order to help the people of the world. This ends up leading to his death. His death works because his arc is complete, but his objective, giving the drive to the press, isn't. His development isn't cut short and is therefore still intact, but his death came before he was able to complete his new personal mission, which makes the death feel more impactful. In the first film, he develops in spite of his established character. In the sequel, he develops in accordance with his characterization. This isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing, since character arcs can be caused by all kinds of things, but it does tell us something about the direction in which both films take their characters, and it can serve as some sort of precedent for other characters' development. While it is true that, once again, these aren't the same characters, a case can be made that they serve the same purpose. They're both humanoid versions of aquatic animals that are the muscle of each squad, but the connection goes slightly deeper. David Ayer, the director of the 2016 film, had considered using King Shark for his lineup, but wasn't comfortable with the CG work necessary for such a character, and therefore decided to go with Killer Croc instead. This ended up being the right choice, as the film won an Oscar for the practical design of the reptilian villain. Killer Croc is a Floridian circus wrestler who has a genetic condition called regressive atavism. Effectively, some of his genetic components are closely related to his ancient ancestors, instead of just his parents. Somehow, this means that he turns into a crocodile. Throughout the first act of the film, Croc is shown to see himself as a monster. He asks to be kept in the sewers instead of in a cell. He chooses not to socialize with the other inmates. This continues into the second and third acts. Even in the bar scene, he sits in a booth, away from everyone else, while they sit at the bar. Eventually, he does start to act more proactively when he helps to plant the bomb in the climax and when he chooses to participate in the final fight. However, we haven't seen enough of him to know if this is character change or just a trait. He chooses to help plant the bomb because it's underwater, which he considers his natural habitat. He joined in on the fight in the climax, but this could have been out of self-preservation, as the machine was going to destroy the entire world. There's no precedent set in the film. We simply don't know. Yes, the characterization is effective, absolutely nothing against it, love it. There's just not a lot of it. If there was more time for the audience to connect to the character, there may be some level of character development, but due to the limited screen time, we simply don't know. King Shark's characterization is also quite well implemented. He has no friends. This makes him sad. His primary motivation for the film is to fit in and get friends. He attempts to create a disguise to join the rest of the squad at the bar. He tries to make friends with a strange fish at Jotunheim. He joins his friends to fight the giant starfish. This is all to get friends. That's what he wants, and that never changes. Even his introduction, in which he is pretending to read a book, is him trying to fit in. This scene establishes him not only as needing friendship, but also as stupid. This remains true for the entire movie, and doesn't change. How do these characters change throughout their movies? Killer Croc and King Shark happen to be examples of static characters. Their motivations are well established, but there's no big change in their characters. The two are characterized fairly effectively. Both are the monster. They're completely alien from the others and don't have any friends at the start of the film. The biggest change for their characters is that they are somewhat social with the rest of their respective squads. However, this isn't character development, as nothing about them changes.
This is simply in line with their characterization from the start.
Waller isn't present for a lot of both movies. She's not a main character in the sense that she has a lot of screen time. She is, however, crucial to both the plots of the films, as she is the one to coerce or force the members of both squads to participate in the mission. Without her, there is no Suicide Squad. Furthermore, she is one of the 4 characters from this 2016 film to return for the sequel. She isn't necessarily presented as a hero or villain, but somewhere in between. She does morally grey things, but she does it for the greater good. Being an employee of the American government, the greater good means the best possible outcome for the American government. In the first film, Waller's operation is in its infancy. With Task Force X authorized mere days before the mission starts for the squad, Waller is still testing the program. The fact that the Suicide Squad has never been assembled before doesn't stop her from being brutal, uncompromising, and self-serving. Even with the safety of the entire planet at stake, she puts herself first, making it the squad's mission to save her, not the world. Even on a smaller level, when she's dealing with people that aren't hardened criminals, she's still mean, dominant, and ruthless. Her disregard for human life reaches the point where she's not only killing criminals vying for their freedom, but also innocent people that work directly under her. She doesn't care for anyone other than herself and, by extension, her position of power in the US government. As for character development, there's not much to speak of. Her personality doesn't change throughout the film. By the end, she still doesn't care about anyone. This is demonstrated through the fact that she threatens to kill the villains mere seconds after they saved the world. That being said, she does compromise when it comes to the reward that the members get. Aside from 10 years off their sentence, they each can ask for one thing, whether it's Deadshot seeing his daughter, Harley getting a coffee machine, or Killer Croc getting a television in his cell. She fulfills every request. In the film, as well as in the novelization, she even goes the extra mile to give them more than they asked for. She gives Deadshot a punching bag, Harley some books to read, and Killer Croc better food and the promise of a gaming console. She has developed as a person. We see the consequences of that change, but we don't see her doing these things. We can speculate on her development, but we don't see her after the climax. These are then implicit changes. As for the sequel, Waller is still the same unfeeling person she was in the first film. She doesn't treat inmates with any respect and is anywhere between disrespectful and downright mean to her staff. She threatens to kill Bloodsport's daughter if he doesn't leave the Suicide Squad. That is a perfect demonstration of the character. She is cold, dominant, and she doesn't care for human life in the slightest. She still acts in the interest of the US government, but is a lot more proactive in her choice of mission. Where the previous installment was a counter-reaction to a development inside of the USA, the sequel is a preemptive strike against a foreign nation. Waller doesn't have a character arc in the second installment. She is used to highlight others' character development, especially Rick Flag's and Bloodsport's arcs. Characterization of the antagonist is a more delicate art. The same principles apply, of course, but even more so than with the protagonists. It is important that there's a balance between the positive and the negative elements of the character. Some bad guys may just kick the dog, but it might be more interesting if they also rescue a kitten along the way. It is incredibly important to establish a motivation for why a character is doing something that is directly related to the thing that they are doing.
It wouldn't make much sense for a villain to decimate the continent of South America
as a result of a Martian calling him a dickhead. Not only is the direction completely irrational, but the scope of the reaction is absolutely unwarranted for the cause of the reaction. Suicide Squad has two major antagonists. The most important one is Enchantress. She is directly responsible for all of the problems throughout the film. The second would be Incubus, her brother, who gave her the opportunity to escape from under Amanda Waller's thumb. Let's take a look at their motivation. Enchantress is wronged by Waller, so it makes sense for her to target her captain. However, the witch doesn't take revenge. Even when she has Amanda Waller and is able to kill her whenever she wants, she doesn't, using her knowledge instead to destroy the rest of the world. The reasoning given for this in the film is the following. Humanity used to worship the gods. Now they worship machines. Therefore, the gods built a machine to destroy humanity. This is only said once throughout the entire film in a scene between Enchantress and Incubus, where they speak a different language from the rest of the movie. The antagonists are characterized with their sense of superiority. They perceive themselves as gods, although they are categorized as metahumans, and therefore believe that they should be worshipped. Enchantress rebels against Waller's oppression, but to no avail. When she is eventually able to break free, with help from her brother, she immediately starts wreaking havoc. The both of them display a complete lack of empathy for humans and anger as a result of their prolonged captivity. The Suicide Squad, on the other hand, had 4 major antagonists. Each antagonist is characterized in a different way. Luna is displayed in a romantic setting. The audience spends most of our time with him through the eyes of Harley Quinn, who is attracted to him. Therefore, we see him in a positive light. However, it quickly becomes clear that he is a cruel tyrant, resulting in his death. He does a great job of threatening to kick the dog. He says that he will imprison and kill his political rivals' families. General Suarez isn't any better. From his very first scene, he exhibits signs of recklessness and violent tendencies. This continues throughout the film. He threatens to release Starro in the US. He threatens to kill the Thinker for questioning him, and he is ruthless in torturing Harley Quinn. More importantly, he kills the birdies. Other characters even speak of how dangerous he is. The squad's enemies outright mention his extreme interrogation tactics. This further shows how evil Suarez actually is, in accordance with Brandon Sanderson's laws. The Thinker is established as an uncaring individual who puts himself first, scientific advancement second, and nothing third. This level of greed and apathy is emphasized through the scene before Starro's release. The Thinker states that he believes the Americans to be squeamish when it comes to what is necessary for scientific advancement. What is necessary being mass torture and mass murder. Furthermore, when his life is in danger, he cooperates without any hesitation and sacrifices his dignity for even the slightest chance of survival. This proves inadequate. Starro is characterized as peaceful until provoked. He only attacks after being forced into an alien environment and tortured. After decades of pain and experimentation, it only makes sense for him to act out violently. Even though he speaks through others' mouths, his dialogue is effective at establishing empathy. He makes a point of wishing that he had been left alone, but that human cruelty had caused it to become violent. The only reason that he attacked was because of the cruelty it had experienced at the hands of humans, making it the only reason it ultimately died, too. There is no real character development to speak of with any of these antagonists, but that isn't really necessary for the story. The characterization does a great job of establishing empathy with the villains. There are way too many characters in these films to talk about each of them individually, but it is still important to cover the way that these films handle their side characters. Having fleshed out protagonists and a great cast of characters in the spotlight is one thing, but giving some respect to the seemingly insignificant characters can be very important too. Keep in mind that by far most of these characters have no character arc because they're either not around very long or don't have a lot of screen time. In the first installment, there aren't many side characters to speak of. Slipknot, Katana, the Seals, and the Joker are the only examples in this film. Firstly, there's not much to say about Slipknot. He's shown to be quite brash. He doesn't have much of a chance to show any other traits, as his head is blown off only a few scenes after its introduction. Katana actually does have a lasting impact on the film. She joins the squad at the beginning of the second act and remains at Flag's side until the very end of the movie. That being said, we don't learn much about her beyond the fact that her husband was murdered and that she has the sword in which his soul is trapped. Katana only serves as muscle throughout the film and doesn't have much of a personality to speak of. She keeps to herself, remains silent, and doesn't develop. The SEALs that accompany the squad on their mission are barely characters. Although many of them had names in the novelization, only the most important one, the one that sets off the explosive during the climax, GQ, got named in the film. Once, right before his death. They don't develop in the movie at all and aren't characterized at all past being army guys. The Joker, on the other hand, is quite the side character. It is possible that this character is only as fleshed out as he is because he was supposed to be in more of the movie, but that's neither here nor there. The Joker is unpredictable and is undeniably damaged. One of the only scenes featuring the Joker shows him killing someone for liking Harley but refusing to take her as a gift. This scene, as well as the Joker driving a car into a river, is portrayed as irrational. We can observe that the Joker is damaged because he has the word damaged tattooed on his forehead. Speaking of his tattoos, they tell us more about the character. He has a laughing mouth tattoo on the back of his hand. This tells us that he is the Joker. He has ha 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 tattooed on his chest. This tells us that he is the Joker. He also has the word Joker tattooed on him. Believe it or not, this tells us that he is, in fact, the Joker. The clown doesn't develop throughout the movie and is only motivated by his desire to retrieve Harley Quinn. In the novelization, this is because Joker wants to kill Harley, but there seems to be no trace of that left in the theatrically released version of Suicide Squad. The sequel, on the other hand, had a wealth of side characters. Firstly, let's talk about Team 1. The team consisted of 9 members. Savant is the best established character on the team. He's shown to not have much of a regard for life and be motivated by his desire for freedom. He's not the most social person, and he doesn't like interacting with the team, but is constantly focused on the mission. The Weasel is the least developed character on the team. This is mostly due to the fact that he, or it, can't talk. We only know that it killed 27 children and can't swim. TDK isn't characterized very well, as he doesn't have any well-defined character traits and doesn't develop. Blackguard's main character trait is stupidity. He thinks the Weasel is a dog, can't figure out how a seatbelt works without help, and tries to make a deal with the quote Maltese government, which ends up blowing up in his face in the most literal sense. Javelin's character consists mostly of him being German. That's not much of a character, but makes for a few decent jokes. Mangal is cocky, as demonstrated by her attempt to take care of the helicopter, which directly results in the death of not only herself, but also Captain Boomerang. Captain Boomerang is cocky, but in an entirely different way than Mangal. He taunts the other villains with the knowledge that his previous experiences on the squad have given him. He's proactive, as shown by his attempts to stop Blackguard from giving away the squad's position. He's annoying on purpose, as shown by him getting on Savant's nerves. Sosoria only cares about one thing, that being justice for the people of Corto Maltese. Even after the squad slaughtered the rebel forces, she still helps them with their mission, because it would be a big hit against Silvio Luna. The other member of the Freedom Fighters, Milton, on the other hand, is completely different from Sosoria. Where Sosoria is proactive and fearless, Milton is unobtrusive and easily scared. Milton is so withdrawn, in fact, that Harley Quinn and Bloodsport don't even remember that he was with them when he died. Finally, Waller's tech support team. At the beginning of the film, they're terrified of their boss. They recognize that threatening to murder someone's daughter is actually pretty fucked up. Waller constantly does things that they see as questionable. Eventually, when Waller is about to kill the remaining members of the squad leading into the climax, a member of the tech support team knocks them out, and they all decide to help the squad defeat Starro. There are a fair few differences between the movies here. In the first film, the side characters are barely established and most of them are killed off. Out of all the side characters, the Joker is the one with the most well-defined personality. There's definitely no character development when it comes to these side characters, and they're barely nuanced. In the sequel, however, most, if not all of the side characters have have at least some level of personality. Not all of them are very fleshed out, but that's to be expected with 5 minutes of screen time, and isn't very important as these characters aren't the central point of attention for these films. As mentioned in Chapter 1, motivation is one of the most important factors in character development and characterization. The ways in which these films handle the subject diverges in some key ways. In the first installment, every member of the Suicide Squad is driven to cooperate by the same factors: desire for freedom and the threat of death. Some characters have additional motivators. Deadshot is motivated by his daughter, Flag is motivated by his girlfriend, and El Diablo is motivated by his guilt after losing his family. However, this deeper level of motivation isn't present for all characters. Killer Croc and Captain Boomerang feel somewhat flat compared to the other characters because they're only there because they have to be. Slipknot and other minor characters especially fall victim to this trend. If the characters are barely involved in the story in the first place, there's no real reason for them to have any motivation, because having motivation to do something is only relevant when you're actually doing something. The sequel makes a point of the fact that members of the squad all chose to join in. Sure, not all of them chose to do so in a vacuum, but they all chose to join the Suicide Squad for a reason. With a name like that, it better be a good one. This is important because it creates a fundamental requirement for motivation. Whether it be keeping the peace, wanting to protect your daughter, or wanting to be a hero, everyone important had a reason to join beyond shortening their sentences. This divergence in motivation also paved the way for divergence in beliefs, leading to more believable conflict within the squad. Take, for example, the fight between Peacemaker and Rick Flag. The two had diametrically opposed beliefs. Their beliefs were the reason they both joined the squad in the first place. This gives the fight a higher level of personal stakes and helps the audience get genuinely invested in the fight itself as well as the consequences. Progress is another integral part of character development. An arc has to be grounded in some consistency and needs to be gradual. Consistency is important because it allows the audience to understand the character's development, as well as providing a baseline off of which to grow the character's worldview. When talking about consistency, we're not talking about everything needing to be the same. That would fundamentally go against the idea of character development. What we mean with this term is that the logic behind the changes needs to be consistent. Having a solid foundation on which to build a character arc results in an overall stronger arc. A character arc also often needs to be gradual. There has to be multiple steps for the development to be logical. Radical changes can be jarring for an audience. Something that was established in Chapter 1 is that people like being able to relate to a character. The same is true for how quickly they change. People tend to take a long time to change their core beliefs. Therefore, a character's core beliefs shouldn't change quickly. We want to take as much time as possible. This applies to both the amount of important scenes and the total screen time. Let's apply this idea to the films. In Suicide Squad, there is simply less time for the characters to change. Their mission starts about halfway through the movie, which means that the characters have approximately an hour of runtime to experience their character arcs and solve their conflicts. In the Suicide Squad, that time is doubled. This allows for more and complexer arcs.
Overall, I still love the Suicide Squad, and don't like Suicide Squad. I feel like I've built up a tolerance for 2016's deep flaws over the many times I've watched that movie making this, so I'll probably be rating it more highly than it realistically deserves.
I'm feeling a D tier for Suicide Squad. It's very bad, especially when we analyze it from a character perspective. I prefer it in some ways over Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, as it at least tries to use the characters from the comics, even if it makes some decisions. But that may be the excessive rewatches talking.
As for the Suicide Squad, it's an easy S tier. It has a couple flaws if you look at it from specific perspectives, but they're so insignificant they don't knock the film down a tier. The character work is excellent, and the plot is really strong. Also, it somehow managed to make an over-the-top 50-meter-high, huge, purple, 5-armed alien starfish's death by rats chewing out a single punctured eyeball as large as a house a real emotional moment. So I realistically can't dislike it. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Make sure to subscribe and smash like. The next video in this series will be about Wonder Woman and Wonder Woman 1984. Until then, remember the wise words of Starro the Conqueror.
I was happy, floating, staring at the stars.
I too was happy once, until I watched Suicide Squad 7 times to write this essay.